Her house had no bedroom, until neighbors found she slept inside the chimney. Willa Marsh had been sleeping inside the chimney for 3 winters before anyone found out. Not inside the flue. She wanted to be precise about that, if only to herself, because the distinction mattered, and because she was a person who had always been precise about things, even when the things were things she would have preferred not to have to be precise about. Not inside the narrow, vertical shaft where the smoke went. Inside the chimney breast, which was the broad stone structure that housed the flue, and that extended from the ground floor of the cottage to above the roof line, and that had, on its ground floor interior face, a space. The space had been there when she bought the cottage. She had not known it was there when she bought the cottage, which was something she thought about occasionally in the way you thought about things that had turned out to be more significant than they appeared at the point of their discovery. She had found it in the second week of ownership, while she was trying to understand the specific behavior of the fireplace, which was drawing poorly, and which she had been investigating with the focused determination of a woman who had spent everything she had on a small stone cottage in the hill country of Wales, and who could not afford to have anything wrong with it. The cottage was in a village called Lanmore, which had 240 people and a pub, and a post office that was open 3 days a week, and the specific quality of Welsh hill country villages, which was the quality of a place that had been what it was for long enough that it had stopped feeling the need to explain itself. She had bought it for £11,000, which was a price that communicated its own story. The story of a structure that had been assessed by the county as residential in a technical sense and as problematic in a practical one. The problematic quality was the size. The cottage was the footprint of what had once been a larger structure, the larger structure having been modified and reduced over 2 centuries of agricultural use and occasional human habitation, until what remained was a single ground floor room of approximately 240 square feet, with a ceiling that was adequate for a person of average height, if average height was defined as not exceeding 5 feet 8 inches. 1 room. The room had a fireplace on the north wall, a window on the south wall, a door on the east wall, a kitchen area that was the legacy of a previous owner's optimism, fitted along the west wall with a camping-grade cooker connected to a propane cylinder, and a sink that worked when the pump worked, and a half-size refrigerator that worked when the electricity worked, and the electricity worked most of the time. The room had no bedroom. This was not an oversight. It was a description of the structure's reality. There was no upstairs. There was no loft. There was the room, and the room was all of it. She had known this when she bought it. She had bought it with the knowledge of its limitations, because its limitations were the reason it cost £11,000, and £11,000 was what she had, and a structure with limitations that she could manage was what she needed. And she had calculated, in the honest accounting way she calculated things, that the management was within her capability. She was 59 years old. She had been a secondary school mathematics teacher for 31 years in Cardiff, and had retired 18 months before she bought the cottage on the medical advice of a doctor who had looked at her blood pressure readings and her sleep records and the specific thinness of her face, and had said, with the directness of someone who believed directness was a form of respect, that she needed to stop at a pace that was different from the pace she was going, before she stopped in a way she would not recover from. She had stopped. She had stopped teaching and had moved out of the Cardiff flat she had rented for 22 years, and had used the money she had saved with the specific economy of a single woman who had lived carefully for 31 years, to buy the cheapest habitable property she could find in a place that was not Cardiff, and that had the quality of quietness she had been told she needed. The £11,000 had bought the cottage. The cottage had 1 room and a fireplace, and the challenge of being a home for a person who had specific requirements. The main requirement being a place to sleep that was not on the floor of a 240 square foot room, which was what it was when she first arrived, and which was what she was going to change. The space inside the chimney breast had presented itself on the 10th day of ownership. She had been examining the fireplace from inside, which was what investigating a poorly drawing fireplace required, crouching in the firebox with a torch and looking up the flue for the obstruction she had assumed was the cause. She had not found an obstruction in the flue, but she had, in the process of examining the interior of the firebox from close range, noticed that the back left corner of the firebox did not meet the chimney breast wall in the way that it should have met it. There was a gap. She had pressed against the wall beside the gap. The wall had moved. What she found when she investigated properly, in the way she investigated things that required proper investigation, was that the left interior face of the chimney breast at ground level had been modified at some point in the structure's history. The modification had created a space beside the flue rather than within it, a recess in the chimney breast mass that was approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide and 5 feet high, lined on 3 sides with the original stone of the chimney breast, and on the 4th side with the timber partition that had separated it from the firebox and that opened on a hinge that had become stiff with age and disuse. The space was warm. This was the specific quality that made the discovery significant. The chimney breast was warm because the chimney breast was the mass through which the heat of the fire traveled, and which absorbed that heat and radiated it outward. And the space within the chimney breast received the radiated heat from 3 stone walls, and was therefore, when the fire was burning, considerably warmer than the room outside it. She understood immediately what she had found. She understood it as a mathematician who had spent 31 years teaching the practical applications of geometry and thermodynamics to 15-year-olds, understood things, which was with the specific clarity of someone for whom the principles behind the phenomenon were not abstract, but immediately legible. She also understood, less explicitly but with equal clarity, what the space could be used for. She spent 2 weeks making the space habitable. The making habitable required the specific practical creativity of a woman who had 11,000 pounds in total assets and no capacity for professional assistance, and a space that was geometrically unusual in ways that made standard solutions inapplicable. The sleeping surface was the first problem. The space was 6 feet long, which accommodated a sleeping body, and 3 feet wide, which accommodated a sleeping body with no lateral excess, and 5 feet high, which accommodated a sitting body with 2 inches of clearance. She built a platform from timber she bought at the salvage yard in Abergavenny, which was the nearest town of useful size, and which she transported in the back of the second-hand Land Rover she had bought for 3,000 pounds because the hill country roads required a vehicle that understood them. The platform was fitted to the dimensions of the space with the precision that her mathematics background made second nature, and raised the sleeping surface 6 inches from the floor of the recess to provide storage beneath. The storage beneath the platform held the things that the single room could not hold without becoming unnavigable: the extra bedding and the seasonal clothing, and the books that she was not currently reading. She fitted a curtain across the opening, rather than a door, because a door would have required a frame, and the frame would have required fitting into the stone in a way that was beyond the tools she had, and because a curtain was adequate for the purpose, which was the purpose of creating the psychological separation between sleeping and waking, that she had decided was a requirement, rather than a luxury. The curtain was made from a wool blanket she had bought at a market in Abergavenny for £3, folded in half and hemmed with the hand sewing she had learned from her mother, and had not used since her 20s. She lined the sleeping space with the specific material she identified as optimal for the thermal and acoustic environment. Cork tiles on the floor, because cork was insulating and soft and available cheaply. A layer of recycled wool insulation from the salvage yard applied to the ceiling, because the ceiling was the one surface not in contact with warm stone, and was therefore the surface through which heat was lost. She had, within 2 weeks of finding the space, a sleeping place that was warm when the fire was burning, and retained its warmth for several hours after the fire was banked for the night, which in the hill country winters of Lanmore was the difference between a sleeping temperature that was comfortable and one that was not. She slept in it the first night on the 15th day of ownership, and understood, lying in the specific warmth of 3 stone walls, radiating the heat of the evening's fire, that she had found something that was both her solution to a practical problem and something that was genuinely itself, a kind of rest that the 240-square-foot room, with its single window and its mathematical austerity, had not provided. She did not tell anyone about the sleeping space, not because she was ashamed of it, because it was hers, and because the specific quality of her privacy about the things that were hers had been part of who she was for 59 years. And she had no reason to change it. She went to the pub on Friday evenings, and to the post office on the 3 days it was open, and to the small market in the square on the first Saturday of the month, and she was recognized over the years as the Englishwoman in the old cottage on the hill, which was not entirely accurate, because she was Welsh from Cardiff and not English at all, but which she had not corrected because the inaccuracy was inconsequential, and correction would have required more engagement with the village's categorization systems than she had found necessary. She knew her neighbors in the way of rural neighbors who were adjacent rather than social. The nod and the occasional exchange of information about the weather, or the road condition, or the specific topics that rural adjacency produced. The closest neighbors were a family named Hughes, whose farm was the property directly below hers on the hill, and the Hugheses knew her as the woman who bought the marsh cottage and who had fixed the dry stone wall on the boundary that had been collapsing for years, which she had done in her second summer, using a guide she had found in the village library and the stones that were there. She had been in Lanmore for 3 years when the winter found her. The winter was not unusual by the standards of the hill country. It was a hill country winter, which meant it was the kind of winter that the hill country produced, and that the people who lived in the hill country had developed the practices and the buildings and the specific competence for over generations of living in it. The cold was cold in the way of elevated land in Wales in January. The snow came when it came, and was measured in the way of snow that fell on terrain that shaped its distribution in ways that flat country did not. What was unusual was the ice storm. It came on a Tuesday in February, following 3 days of temperatures that had oscillated around freezing in the specific way that produced the worst ice conditions. The temperature dropping just enough overnight to freeze the surfaces, and rising just enough in the day to melt the top layer and refreeze it by evening, in a configuration that was smoother than the previous configuration. By the Tuesday, the cottage lane was a surface that Willa had assessed on Monday evening and had decided was not navigable on foot in the dark, and had decided on Tuesday morning was not navigable on foot in the daylight either. She was inside the cottage when the ice storm arrived, which was the correct place to be. She had the fire and the stored wood, and the food she kept in adequate supply because she had learned in the first winter that supply management in the hill country was the difference between a power cut or a road closure being inconvenient and being serious. She was not in distress. The Hughes family did not know she was not in distress. Mayor Hughes, who was 64 and had lived on the farm below for 40 years, and who had the specific knowledge of the hill country that 40 years of living in a place accumulated, had looked at the cottage lane from the farm track on Tuesday morning and had seen what the Tuesday morning showed, which was ice on every surface and no smoke from the cottage chimney and no sign of activity. The no smoke from the cottage chimney was the thing. Smoke from a chimney was visible from the farm track and was the specific visual signal that a person was inside and had a fire and was managing. The absence of smoke was the signal that either a person was not inside or a person was inside and did not have a fire. And either of those signals, on a February morning with ice on every surface, was a signal that Mayor Hughes had lived in the hill country long enough to take seriously. She had called her son Reese, who was 38, and who had the physical capability and the hill country competence to manage the lane in the current conditions. And Reese had put on the appropriate footwear and had gone up to the cottage to check. Willa had banked the fire the previous evening and had not rebuilt it that morning because the chimney breast had retained sufficient warmth through the night and the morning, and she had been occupied with other things and had not gotten to it yet. She was occupied with the notebook she kept on the shelf beside the sleeping space and that she wrote in each morning before doing anything else, the practice she had developed in the first year and that had become the foundational activity of her days, in the way that certain practices became foundational when they were done consistently enough. She was writing in the notebook when Reese Hughes knocked on the door. She opened it. Reese was a broad-shouldered man with the outdoor complexion of someone who spent most of his time outside and who had the direct manner of the hill country without any of the distance that directness sometimes produced. He said his mother had seen no smoke and had been concerned, and that he had come to check she was all right. She said she was quite all right, thank you. He looked past her at the room. He looked at the cold fireplace. He looked at the room more carefully, the way a person looked at a room when they were trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had expected to see. He said, was she warm enough? She said she was warm enough, yes. He looked at the room again. His eyes went to the chimney breast and the curtain hanging across the left side of it. He looked at the curtain for a moment. He said he would be glad to get the fire going for her if she would like. She said she would get it going herself once she had finished what she was doing, but that she appreciated the offer. He nodded and said his mother would be glad to know she was all right and that they were just below if she needed anything. She thanked him. She closed the door. She knew he had seen the curtain. She knew what the curtain looked like from the outside, which was a curtain hanging across the left side of the chimney breast in a position that did not have an obvious explanation to someone who had not found the space behind it. She went to the fireplace and built the fire. Mayor Hughes came the following Thursday, not to inquire about the curtain. Mayor was too direct for that kind of approach, and had instead used the ice storm's aftermath, which had produced a legitimate reason to bring soup and to come inside, and to sit at the table in the way that hill country neighbors sat at tables when they had decided that sitting at the table was the appropriate thing to do. She brought the soup, and she came inside, and she sat at the table. She looked at the room with the attention of a woman who had been in this cottage for various reasons over the 40 years she had lived below it, and who knew the room in the way of a person familiar with a place, and was therefore capable of noticing what was different from what she remembered. She looked at the curtain. She said she hoped Reese had not been intrusive the other morning. Willa said he had not been intrusive at all. Mayor said she had been concerned when she had not seen smoke. Willa said she understood. There was a moment. Mayor looked at the curtain. She said it was none of her business. Willa said it was quite all right. She said she would show her if she was curious. Mayor said she was curious, yes. Willa went to the curtain and pulled it aside. Mayor looked at the sleeping space. She looked at the platform and the bedding and the cork tiles and the insulated ceiling and the 3 stone walls of the chimney breast, and the way the whole thing fitted into the chimney breast mass with the precision of something that had been designed for the space it occupied. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that was clever. Willa said it was warm. Mayor said she imagined it was, with the chimney walls on 3 sides. She asked how Willa had found the space. Willa explained about the poorly drawing fireplace and the investigation and the gap in the firebox corner and the hinged partition. Mare said she had been in this cottage many times over 40 years and had never known that space was there. Willa said neither had she until she went looking for the obstruction. Mare looked at the sleeping space for another moment. Then she looked at the room and the curtain and the fire that was now burning steadily, and the notebooks on the shelf beside the sleeping space entrance, and the single window on the south wall, and the mathematical austerity of a room that a person had made into a home by understanding it exactly as it was, and working within that understanding rather than against it. She said she would tell Reese he had been right to come up. Willa said she was glad he had come. Mare said, had she been warm enough through the ice storm? Willa said yes. Mare said the chimney breast retained heat for longer than she would have expected. Willa said the specific heat capacity of the stone was quite high, and that the mass of the chimney breast was sufficient to retain significant warmth for several hours after the fire was banked. Mare looked at her. She said, you worked that out. Willa said she was a mathematics teacher. Had been. Mare said had been. Willa said yes. Mare said what had happened. Willa said health. She said she had been told she needed to stop and she had stopped. Mare said and she had come here. Willa said she had come here. Mare looked around the room again. The carefully made space, the notebooks, the precision of a person who had understood what she had and had worked within it. She said she thought Lanmore suited her. Willa said she thought it did too. Mare said she should come to dinner on Saturday. Willa said she would like that. Mare took her soup bowl and washed it at the sink and put it back on the table and put on her coat. At the door she turned around. She said the space in the chimney breast. Willa said yes. Mare said she thought that was one of the most practical solutions to a problem she had encountered in 40 years of hill country living. Willa said she was glad the problem had presented itself. Mare said she was glad she had found the space. She opened the door. She went down the ice-cleared lane toward the farm, her boots certain on the ground she had known for 40 years. Willa watched her go. Then she closed the door and went to her notebooks and opened the one she had been writing in when Reese had knocked. She wrote about the ice storm and about the specific thermal performance of the chimney breast over the 48 hours of the worst conditions, and about what she had observed about the relationship between the fire's duration and the heat retained in the stone, and about the way the space had maintained a temperature that was not warm in the way a heated room was warm, but warm in the way that sufficient was warm when sufficient was what you had, and you had understood it precisely and arranged yourself within it accordingly. She wrote for an hour. The fire burned. The chimney breast held its warmth. Outside, the hill country was what it was in February, which was cold and clear and entirely itself. Inside the cottage on the hill in Lanmore, Willa Marsh was warm.